Hello, my sleepy friends. History is filled with kings, warriors, explorers, and rulers whose lives shaped entire civilizations. But sometimes it is not their victories, their battles, or their empires that people remember the most. Sometimes what echoes through history is how they died. Across centuries, there are moments when death itself became a final dramatic chapter. Strange, heroic, tragic, or so unbelievable that historians still talk about it today. One of the most legendary examples comes from King Pyrrhus of Epirus, a brilliant Greek commander who fought the rising power of Rome around the 3rd century BCE. Pyrrhus was famous for battlefield brilliance and daring strategy. His campaigns were so costly that they gave history the phrase Pyrrhic victory, meaning a win that destroys the victor almost as much as the enemy. Yet despite surviving countless battles and military campaigns, the king met his end in a way no general could ever predict. During a chaotic street battle in the city of Argos, Pyrrhus personally entered the narrow streets with his soldiers. The fighting was intense, with warriors clashing house to house in the darkness. According to ancient historians, as Pyrrhus moved through the city pursuing enemies, a woman watching from a rooftop threw down a heavy roof tile toward the street below. The tile struck Pyrrhus in the head, stunning him instantly. A nearby enemy soldier then recognized the wounded king and delivered the final blow. One of the most feared commanders of the ancient world, a man who had fought massive armies and war elephants, died not on a grand battlefield but because of a simple tile dropped from above. Another extraordinary story comes from Aeschylus, one of the greatest playwrights of ancient Greece. Aeschylus lived in the 5th century BCE and helped shape the foundations of Greek theater. Yet according to later historical accounts, his death came through one of the strangest accidents ever recorded in history. Ancient writers tell the story of an eagle flying high above the ground carrying a tortoise. Eagles often drop tortoises onto rocks to crack their shells open. Unfortunately, the eagle reportedly mistook the bald head of Aeschylus for a stone below. The bird dropped the tortoise, which struck the playwright and killed him instantly. Whether the story is perfectly accurate or slightly exaggerated by later writers, it became one of the most bizarre deaths ever associated with a famous figure. Then there is the case of Attila the Hun, one of the most feared leaders in European history. During the 5th century, Attila commanded enormous armies that swept across much of Europe, striking terror into the Roman Empire. Cities fell before him, and entire regions feared his arrival. Yet the death of this powerful warlord came not during battle, but during a celebration. Historical accounts suggest that Attila died suddenly on the night of his wedding to a new bride. According to the Roman historian Priscus, Attila had been drinking heavily during the feast. Later that night, he suffered a severe nosebleed while lying on his back, which caused him to choke during his sleep. By morning, the great conqueror was found dead in his chamber. A man who had terrified empires did not fall on the battlefield, but in a quiet room after a night of celebration. Another unforgettable death belongs to King Alexander I of Greece, who ruled during the early 20th century. While visiting the royal gardens in 1920, Alexander attempted to separate his dog from a monkey that had escaped from the palace zoo. During the struggle, the monkey attacked and bit the king multiple times. The wounds became infected, and despite medical treatment, Alexander died several weeks later. What makes this death particularly remarkable is that historians believe his sudden passing caused a chain of political changes that eventually influenced events leading toward World War II. Then history gives us the astonishing death of Tycho Brahe, one of the most famous astronomers of the Renaissance. Brahe was known for his extremely precise observations of the stars before the invention of telescopes. Yet according to traditional historical accounts, his death came from a very unusual social problem. During a royal banquet in 1601, Brahe reportedly refused to leave the table to use the bathroom because doing so would have been considered rude in front of the host. He held his bladder for too long, which caused severe complications. Days later, he became seriously ill and eventually died. Though modern historians debate some details of the story, it remains one of the strangest deaths connected to a major scientific figure. Another dramatic historical death belongs to King Charles VIII of France. In 1498, Charles was walking through a corridor of his castle on the way to watch a game of tennis. The ceilings in the passageway were unusually low, and Charles struck his head forcefully against a stone doorway. Though he initially seemed only stunned, he later collapsed and died from the injury. The king who ruled an entire nation lost his life because of a simple architectural hazard. History is filled with these moments where powerful figures meet unexpected endings. Sometimes their deaths were heroic, sometimes tragic, and sometimes strangely ironic. The truth is that no matter how powerful a person becomes, fate often arrives in ways no one could predict, and as we move deeper into history, we begin to encounter even more astonishing stories. Warriors who died standing on the battlefield, rulers whose final moments shocked their empires, and explorers whose deaths became legends told for centuries afterward. Because in many cases, the end of a life can be just as unforgettable as the life itself. History continues to surprise us with endings that feel almost unbelievable, moments where powerful lives closed in ways no storyteller could easily invent. One of the most famous examples comes from King Adolf Fredrik of Sweden, whose death in 1771 has become one of the strangest royal endings ever recorded. Adolf Fredrik was known as a calm and gentle monarch who preferred quiet domestic life over political conflict. Yet on one winter evening, he reportedly consumed an enormous meal that would later become legendary in historical records. The dinner included lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, smoked herring, champagne, and an astonishing number of the king's favorite dessert, sweet buns soaked in warm milk, a dish known in Sweden as semla. By the time the meal ended, the king had eaten far beyond what his body could comfortably handle, and later that night he died from severe digestive complications. Historians often describe him as the king who ate himself to death, an unusual ending for a man who ruled an entire kingdom. Another dramatic and widely discussed death in history belongs to Francis Bacon, the famous English philosopher and scientist of the early 17th century. Bacon was one of the thinkers who helped shape the early development of the scientific method, encouraging experimentation and observation as ways of understanding the natural world. Ironically, his own curiosity may have led directly to his death. During a snowy winter day in 1626, Bacon reportedly became fascinated by the idea that cold temperatures might preserve meat from decay. To test the theory, he stopped his carriage and purchased a chicken from a nearby farm. Standing outside in the freezing weather, Bacon stuffed the chicken with snow to see if the cold would slow the process of spoilage. Unfortunately, the experiment exposed him to intense cold for too long, and he soon became seriously ill with pneumonia. A man who devoted his life to exploring scientific ideas may have died because of one final experiment driven by curiosity. Then there is the extraordinary story of King William II of England, often called William Rufus. In the year 1100, William went hunting in the New Forest, a popular royal hunting ground. During the hunt, one of his companions, a nobleman named Walter Tyrrell, fired an arrow at a deer. The arrow struck a tree, ricocheted unexpectedly, and then hit the king in the chest. William died almost instantly. The circumstances surrounding the incident have fueled centuries of speculation among historians. Some believe it was a tragic accident during a routine hunt, while others suspect it may have been a carefully planned assassination disguised as misfortune. Whatever the truth may be, the sudden death of the king in the forest created an immediate scramble for power in England, showing how a single unpredictable moment could reshape an entire kingdom. Another astonishing historical ending involves the Roman Emperor Valerian, whose fate became one of the most humiliating stories ever associated with a ruler. Valerian ruled during the 3rd century, when the Roman Empire faced constant pressure from enemies along its borders. During a campaign against the powerful Persian Empire, Valerian was captured by the Persian king Shapur the Rus after a disastrous battle. According to later Roman accounts, Valerian was kept alive as a prisoner and forced to serve as a human footstool when the Persian king mounted his horse. Though historians debate how accurately these stories describe his treatment, the humiliation of a Roman emperor captured by an enemy shocked the empire. Eventually, Valerian died in captivity, marking one of the most dramatic and humiliating endings ever experienced by a Roman ruler. History also remembers the incredible death of King Richard I of England, better known as Richard the Lionheart. Richard was famous for his bravery during the Crusades and his reputation as a fearless warrior. Yet the end of his life came not during a massive battle, but during the siege of a relatively small castle in France. In 1199, Richard was inspecting the defenses of the castle when a crossbow bolt fired by a young defender struck him in the shoulder. At first the wound did not appear fatal, but infection soon set in, a common danger before modern medicine. Richard reportedly forgave the young archer who had shot him before he died, demonstrating the complex mixture of brutality and honor that defined medieval warfare. Another remarkable story involves King Charles II of Navarre, whose death became infamous for its bizarre circumstances. Charles had suffered from illness in his later years, and doctors attempted a strange medical treatment common in medieval medicine. His body was wrapped tightly in linen cloth soaked with alcohol to warm him and supposedly improve circulation. According to historical accounts, while a servant was sewing the cloth around the king, the loose thread was accidentally brought too close to a candle flame. The alcohol-soaked cloth caught fire, and the king suffered fatal burns. Though the exact details may have been exaggerated over time, the story became a dramatic reminder of how unpredictable and dangerous early medical treatments could be. History repeatedly shows that power, wealth, and fame never guarantee a peaceful ending. Kings who commanded armies, scientists who studied the universe, and rulers who controlled vast lands often faced final moments shaped by accidents, illness, or unexpected twists of fate. The contrast between the greatness of their lives and the strange circumstances of their deaths is what makes these stories so unforgettable across centuries. And as we continue moving deeper into history, the stories become even more extraordinary. Warriors whose final stands became legends, explorers whose last journeys ended in mystery, and rulers whose deaths triggered events that changed the course of nations forever. History often saves its most unforgettable stories for the final moments of powerful lives. Some deaths became legendary because of their bravery, some because of their strange circumstances, and others because they marked the dramatic collapse of entire empires. One of the most powerful examples is the death of Leonidas I of Sparta, whose final stand at the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BCE became one of the most famous moments in military history. Leonidas led a small Greek force against the enormous invading army of the Persian king Xerxes. The narrow mountain pass of Thermopylae allowed the Greeks to hold back the Persian forces for several days, despite being vastly outnumbered. When the Persians discovered a path around the pass that would allow them to surround the Greek defenders, Leonidas dismissed most of the Greek army to save them. Instead, he remained behind with a small group of Spartans and allies, choosing to fight to the end. Ancient historians describe how the defenders continued battling even after their weapons broke, fighting with swords, spears, and eventually their bare hands. Leonidas died on the battlefield surrounded by his warriors, and the story of his final stand became a symbol of courage and sacrifice remembered for thousands of years. Another astonishing historical death occurred during the fall of Constantinople in 1453, when the Byzantine Empire faced its final battle against the Ottoman forces of Sultan Mehmed II. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine the Phrygian Palaiologos, refused to abandon the city even when defeat became inevitable. As Ottoman troops breached the massive walls of Constantinople after weeks of siege, Constantine reportedly removed his royal insignia so he could fight alongside ordinary soldiers in the streets. According to historical accounts, he declared that he would rather die with his people than flee the city. During the chaos of the final battle, he disappeared among the fighting and was never definitively identified afterward. His body was never officially recovered, which turned his death into a legend whispered for centuries in Greek history. The story of the emperor who vanished while defending his city. Another dramatic ending belongs to Captain James Cook, one of the most famous explorers of the 18th century. Cook led several voyages across the Pacific Ocean, mapping coastlines and islands that were largely unknown to Europeans at the time. His journeys expanded global knowledge of geography and connected distant cultures across oceans. Yet during his third voyage in 1779, Cook's life ended during a violent confrontation in Hawaii. After a dispute between his crew and local islanders escalated, Cook attempted to take a Hawaiian chief hostage to force negotiations. The plan quickly collapsed as tensions rose along the shoreline. In the chaos that followed, Cook was struck and killed during the conflict. The death of one of history's greatest navigators occurred far from his homeland on the shores of a distant island. He had helped introduce to the wider world. Another extraordinary story comes from King Harold II of England, whose death during the Battle of Hastings in 1066 changed the entire course of English history. Harold had just defeated a Viking invasion in the north when he was forced to march south to face the invading Norman army, led by William of Normandy. The two forces met near Hastings in one of the most decisive battles in medieval Europe. According to the famous Bayeux Tapestry, which depicts scenes from the battle, Harold was struck in the eye by an arrow during the fighting. Whether the arrow truly caused his death, or whether he was later killed by Norman knights, remains debated by historians. but his fall during the battle ended Anglo-Saxon rule in England and opened the path for the Norman conquest that reshaped English culture and language forever. History also records the incredible death of Admiral Horatio Nelson, one of Britain's greatest naval commanders. During the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, Nelson led the British fleet against the combined navies of France and Spain during the Napoleonic Wars. Nelson was famous for his bold tactics and inspiring leadership, and during the battle he stood openly on the deck of his flagship HMS Victory. A French sniper aboard an enemy ship spotted him and fired a shot that struck Nelson in the spine. Despite the mortal wound, Nelson remained alive long enough to learn that his fleet had achieved a decisive victory. According to eyewitness accounts, his final words included the famous line, "Thank God I have done my duty." His death occurred at the exact moment of one of the greatest naval victories in British history, sealing his reputation as a national hero. Another unforgettable historical ending belongs to General George Armstrong Custer during the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876. Custer and his cavalry unit encountered a large coalition of Native American warriors led by leaders such as Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. Confident in his military ability, Custer divided his forces and launched an attack that quickly turned disastrous. Surrounded by overwhelming numbers, Custer and his soldiers were defeated in what became known as Custer's Last Stand. The battle became one of the most famous and controversial military defeats in American history, and the dramatic final moments of Custer and his men have been debated and retold for generations. Across centuries, these powerful stories reveal how the final moments of history's most famous figures often became legends themselves. Some deaths symbolized bravery and sacrifice, others marked the collapse of entire kingdoms, and some simply showed how unpredictable fate could be even for the most powerful individuals. And as we continue deeper into the stories of history, even more astonishing endings appear. Rulers brought down by unexpected accidents, warriors who refused to surrender even in defeat, and explorers whose final moments unfolded in lands far from home. History often reaches its most dramatic moments when powerful figures face their final hours. Some deaths become legendary, not because they were strange or accidental, but because they happened at the exact moment when entire worlds were collapsing around them. One of the most famous examples is the death of Julius Caesar, one of the most powerful leaders of ancient Rome. By 44 BCE, Caesar had risen to an almost unmatched level of authority within the Roman Republic. Many senators feared that his growing power would destroy the old republican system and turn Rome into a monarchy under a single ruler. A group of conspirators secretly planned to assassinate him in order to restore what they believed was Roman freedom. On the Ides of March, during a meeting of the Senate, dozens of senators surrounded Caesar and attacked him with daggers. Ancient sources say he was stabbed 23 times. The most famous detail of the story comes from the moment Caesar reportedly recognized one of the attackers as Brutus, a man he trusted. Though historians debate the exact words he spoke, the story of Caesar's shocked reaction became one of the most famous moments in history. His death did not save the Roman Republic as the conspirators hoped. Instead, it triggered a series of civil wars that eventually led to the rise of the Roman Empire under Augustus. Another extraordinary and unforgettable ending belongs to Napoleon Bonaparte, the French general who reshaped Europe during the early 19th century. Napoleon rose from modest origins to become Emperor of France. commanding armies that dominated much of the continent. Yet after years of conflict, his empire collapsed following military defeats and political resistance across Europe. After his final defeat at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, Napoleon was exiled by the British to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic Ocean. There, far from the battlefields and capitals he once controlled, he spent the last years of his life under watch by British authorities. Napoleon died in 1821, likely from stomach illness, though speculation about poisoning has continued for generations. The dramatic contrast between his earlier life of conquest and his lonely death on a distant island made his story one of the most powerful rises and falls in history. History also records the astonishing end of Hernán Cortés, the Spanish conquistador who led the expedition that brought down the Aztec Empire in the early 16th century. Cortés was a man whose actions permanently changed the history of the Americas. With a relatively small group of soldiers, he managed to defeat the powerful Aztec state through alliances, warfare, and disease that devastated the local population. Yet despite his immense influence and wealth gained from conquest, Cortés did not end his life surrounded by the glory he once enjoyed. In his later years, he struggled with political disputes and financial problems after returning to Spain. Though still respected as a historical figure, his final years were marked by frustration as he attempted to regain influence at the Spanish court. Cortés died in 1547 far from the lands he had conquered, leaving behind a legacy that continues to be debated by historians today. Another powerful story of a dramatic death comes from Saladin, the legendary Muslim leader who fought against the Crusader states in the 12th century. Saladin became famous for uniting Muslim territories and defeating Crusader forces, most notably during the Battle of Hattin in 1187, which allowed him to reclaim the city of Jerusalem. Despite ruling a vast territory and commanding enormous armies, Saladin was known for personal humility and generosity. When he died in 1193 in Damascus, historical accounts say that he left behind surprisingly little personal wealth despite his power. One famous story describes how a servant carried a piece of cloth through the streets during Saladin's funeral, announcing that this was all the great ruler would take with him to the grave. The story became a powerful reminder that even the most powerful leaders eventually leave the world with nothing. Another astonishing historical death belongs to Genghis Khan, the founder of the Mongol Empire, and one of the most formidable conquerors in world history. Genghis Khan united the nomadic tribes of Mongolia and created an empire that stretched across enormous parts of Asia and Europe. His armies were known for speed, discipline, and devastating effectiveness. Yet the exact circumstances of his death in 1227 remain one of history's enduring mysteries. Historical sources offer several possibilities. Some suggest he died after falling from a horse during a military campaign, while others describe illness or injuries suffered in battle. The Mongols kept his death secret for some time to prevent enemies from gaining confidence. Even the location of his burial remains unknown today, adding another layer of mystery to the life of a man whose empire reshaped the map of the world. These stories remind us that the end of a life often reveals something powerful about the era in which a person lived. Whether it was betrayal in the Roman Senate, exile on a distant island, quiet death after years of conquest, or a mysterious passing hidden from history. These final moments became part of the larger legends surrounding some of the most influential figures ever to live. And as we continue exploring the epic endings scattered across the centuries, even more dramatic stories begin to appear. Rulers brought down by fate at the height of their power, commanders who refused to surrender even when defeat was certain, and individuals whose final acts became symbols remembered long after their empires disappeared. History often remembers powerful lives not only for what those individuals accomplished, but also for the unforgettable ways in which their stories finally ended. Some deaths became symbols of bravery, others became warnings about power, and some simply showed how unpredictable fate can be even for the greatest leaders. One of the most dramatic endings in world history belongs to Spartacus, the gladiator who led one of the largest slave revolts against the Roman Republic. Spartacus was originally a Thracian soldier who was captured and forced into slavery. He was trained as a gladiator, expected to fight and die for the entertainment of Roman crowds. But in 73 BCE, he escaped with a small group of fellow gladiators from a training school in Capua. What began as a desperate escape soon transformed into a massive rebellion. Thousands of slaves joined Spartacus as his army moved across Italy, defeating several Roman forces sent to stop them. For nearly 2 years, Spartacus challenged the power of Rome itself. Eventually, the Roman general Marcus Licinius Crassus assembled a massive army to crush the rebellion. In the final battle, Spartacus refused to flee, even when defeat became clear. Ancient historians describe how he fought his way through Roman soldiers trying to reach Crassus himself. Spartacus died fighting on the battlefield, and though his body was never definitively identified, his last stand became one of the most legendary acts of resistance in ancient history. Another extraordinary historical death comes from King Gustav II Adolf of Sweden, one of the greatest military commanders of the 17th century. Gustavus Adolphus transformed Sweden into a major European power and introduced military strategies that influenced warfare for centuries. During the 30 Years' War, he led Swedish forces deep into Central Europe. In 1632, he fought at the Battle of Lutzen, one of the most important battles of that long and devastating conflict. The battlefield was covered with thick fog and smoke from gunpowder. Gustavus Adolphus rode into the fighting at the front of his army, personally leading the charge. During the chaos, he became separated from his troops and was surrounded by enemy cavalry. The king was shot multiple times and killed during the fighting. Even though he died in battle, his army eventually won the battle later that day. His death shocked Europe and turned him into one of the most revered military heroes in Swedish history. History also remembers the incredible end of Blackbeard, one of the most famous pirates to ever sail the seas. Blackbeard, whose real name was Edward Teach, terrorized shipping routes across the Caribbean and the American coast during the early 18th century. He became famous for his terrifying appearance, often tying slow-burning fuses into his beard during battle to create clouds of smoke around his face. In 1718, the British government finally sent naval forces to hunt him down. Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy located Blackbeard near the coast of North Carolina. A fierce battle followed as pirates and sailors clashed on the decks of their ships. According to historical accounts, Blackbeard fought fiercely even after suffering multiple gunshot wounds and sword cuts. Witnesses later claimed he was shot 5 times and cut with swords more than 20 times before finally collapsing. His death ended one of the most feared pirate careers in history. Another powerful and tragic ending belongs to Emperor Maximilian I of Mexico. Maximilian was originally an Austrian archduke who who became Emperor of Mexico in the 1860s with the support of France. However, many Mexicans rejected the foreign-backed monarchy and supported the Republican government led by Benito Juárez. After years of conflict, French support for Maximilian collapsed, leaving him isolated. Rather than flee the country, Maximilian chose to remain and face the advancing Republican forces. In 1867, he was captured and sentenced to execution. Standing before the firing squad, Maximilian reportedly addressed the soldiers calmly before the shots were fired. His execution marked the dramatic end of the short-lived Mexican Empire and restored the Republic. Another unforgettable death in history belongs to Joan of Arc, the young French heroine who played a crucial role during the 100 Years' War. Joan claimed to receive visions that guided her to support the French King Charles VII. Despite her youth, she inspired French forces and helped lift the siege of the city of Orléans. Her leadership gave France renewed hope during a desperate time in the war. However, Joan was eventually captured by enemy forces and handed over to church authorities allied with the English. She was put on trial for heresy in 1431. After months of questioning, she was condemned and burned at the stake in the city of Rouen. Her death shocked many people even at the time, and decades later the church declared the trial unjust. Joan of Arc eventually became one of the most famous saints and national symbols in French history. History repeatedly shows that the final chapters of great lives often carry the same intensity as the events that made those individuals famous. Some fought until their final breath on battlefields. Some faced execution with calm courage. Others died in dramatic confrontations that ended entire eras of conflict. And as we continue moving deeper into the stories of history, even more extraordinary endings appear. Rulers struck down by sudden betrayals, explorers who died far from their homelands, and warriors whose final moments became legends, passed down through generations. History also remembers deaths that were not only dramatic, but symbolized the end of entire eras. One powerful example is the death of Cleopatra VII, the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt. Cleopatra was one of the most famous women of the ancient world, known for her intelligence, political skill, and alliances with powerful Roman leaders such as Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony. After Caesar's assassination, Cleopatra supported Antony during the Roman civil wars against Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus. Their forces were eventually defeated in the decisive Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, which shattered their power. As Octavian's armies closed in on Egypt, Antony believed Cleopatra had died and, overcome with despair, attempted to take his own life. When Cleopatra later learned that Octavian intended to capture her and parade her through Rome as a prisoner, she refused to accept such humiliation. According to the most famous historical account, Cleopatra chose to end her life by allowing a poisonous asp, a type of snake, to bite her. Other historians suggest poison may have been used instead. Whatever the exact method, Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the transformation of Egypt into a province of the Roman Empire. Her dramatic final decision turned her into one of the most legendary figures in ancient history. Another epic ending occurred during the final days of Admiral Yi Sun-sin, one of Korea's greatest naval commanders. During the late 16th century, Korea faced invasion from Japanese forces under Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Admiral Yi commanded the Korean Navy and developed brilliant naval tactics that repeatedly defeated larger Japanese fleets. His innovative use of heavily armed warships, including the famous turtle ships, allowed Korea to protect crucial supply routes and resist the invasion. In 1598, during the Battle of Noryang, Admiral Yi led Korean and Allied forces in one final battle against retreating Japanese fleets. As the fighting raged, Yi was struck by a bullet fired by an enemy soldier. Realizing that the battle was still underway, and fearing that news of his death might weaken morale, Yi reportedly told his son and officers not to announce his death until the battle was won. The fighting continued, and the Korean fleet achieved victory. Only after the battle ended did the soldiers learn that their commander had died during the moment of triumph. Admiral Yi's final act of leadership became one of the most respected stories in Korean history. Another unforgettable death belongs to Geronimo, the famous Apache leader who resisted expansion by the United States into Apache lands during the 19th century. Geronimo became known for leading daring raids and escaping capture repeatedly across the harsh deserts and mountains of the American Southwest. After years of conflict, he eventually surrendered in 1886 and spent the rest of his life as a prisoner of war. Though no longer a military leader, he remained a symbol of resistance and resilience for Native American communities. Geronimo died in 1909 after being thrown from his horse during a ride home in cold weather. He lay exposed to the freezing night before being found the next morning, and the illness that followed eventually took his life. Even in death, his story continued to symbolize the long and painful struggle faced by Native peoples during that era. History also records the extraordinary death of Tokugawa Ieyasu, the founder of the Tokugawa shogunate that ruled Japan for more than 250 years. Ieyasu was a master strategist who spent decades navigating alliances and conflicts among powerful feudal lords. His victory at the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600 allowed him to unify Japan under his rule and establish a stable government that brought relative peace after centuries of warfare. In his later years, Ieyasu gradually passed authority to his successors, while carefully designing the political system that would guide Japan for generations. When he died in 1616, his influence remained so powerful that he was later honored as a deity in Japanese tradition. Shrines built in his memory still stand today, showing how his life and death became part of the cultural foundation of Japan. Another remarkable historical ending belongs to Alexander the Great, one of the most famous conquerors in human history. By the age of 32, Alexander had built an empire stretching from Greece across Egypt, Persia, and deep into Asia. His armies marched farther than any Greek force had ever traveled before. Yet despite surviving countless battles, Alexander's life ended suddenly in 323 BCE in the city of Babylon. Ancient sources describe how he fell ill after a banquet and gradually became weaker over several days. The exact cause of his death remains debated by historians even today, with theories ranging from illness to poisoning. What makes his death so dramatic is that he left no clear successor capable of controlling his vast empire. After his passing, his generals fought for control of the territories he had conquered, dividing the empire into rival kingdoms. The death of Alexander did not simply end a life. It triggered decades of conflict that reshaped the ancient world. Across centuries, these epic deaths remind us that even the most powerful figures could not escape the unpredictable nature of fate. Warriors died at the moment of victory. Rulers chose dramatic final acts to avoid humiliation, and conquerors who built enormous empires sometimes left the world suddenly and without warning. And as the stories continue, history reveals even more astonishing final moments. Emperors whose deaths ended entire civilizations, commanders who chose death rather than surrender, and individuals whose final acts turned them into legends, remembered long after their time. History is full of powerful endings where the final moments of a life became just as legendary as the achievements that came before. One of the most dramatic examples is the death of Socrates, the famous Greek philosopher whose ideas helped shape Western philosophy. Socrates spent his life questioning beliefs, encouraging people to think critically about truth, justice, and knowledge. However, his teachings and constant questioning of authority eventually made him unpopular with powerful figures in Athens. In 399 BCE, Socrates was put on trial, accused of corrupting the youth and disrespecting the traditional gods of the city. The trial ended with a death sentence. According to the law of Athens at the time, Socrates was ordered to drink a cup of hemlock, a deadly poison made from a plant extract. His friends urged him to escape from prison, and they had even arranged a possible plan for him to flee the city. Socrates refused, believing that escaping would violate the laws he had spent his life discussing and analyzing. Instead, he calmly accepted the sentence. Ancient accounts describe how he drank the poison while surrounded by his students, continuing to discuss philosophy until the poison slowly paralyzed his body. His death became one of the most powerful examples in history of a person choosing principle over survival. Another unforgettable death belongs to Hannibal Barca, the brilliant Carthaginian general who challenged the Roman Republic during the Second Punic War. Hannibal is remembered for one of the most daring military campaigns ever attempted. In 218 BCE, he led an army, including war elephants, across the dangerous Alps mountains into Italy. Over the next several years, Hannibal defeated Roman armies in several major battles, including the devastating Roman defeat at Cannae. Despite these victories, Carthage eventually lost the war to Rome. Years later, as Rome expanded its power, Hannibal lived in exile while continuing to advise other kingdoms against Roman influence. When Roman forces finally demanded his capture, Hannibal refused to allow himself to become a prisoner of the empire he had fought for so long. According to historical sources, he carried poison with him and chose to take it rather than surrender. His final act symbolized his lifelong resistance against Rome. Another powerful story comes from Jan Hus, a religious reformer from Bohemia, whose ideas challenged corruption within the medieval church. Hus argued that church authority should follow the teachings of the Bible rather than the power of political leaders. His writings gained many followers but also powerful enemies. In 1415, Hus was invited to attend the Council of Constance, where church leaders promised him safe passage to discuss his ideas. Instead, he was arrested, declared a heretic, and sentenced to death. Jan Hus was burned at the stake for refusing to abandon his beliefs. Witnesses recorded that he continued speaking calmly, even as the execution was carried out. His death shocked many people across Europe and later inspired religious reform movements, including ideas that would influence the Protestant Reformation a century later. In this way, His death became a turning point in the long history of religious change in Europe. Another epic historical death belongs to King Robert the Bruce of Scotland, one of the most famous Scottish rulers. Robert the Bruce led Scotland in its struggle for independence against England during the early 14th century. His victory at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 became one of the most important moments in Scottish history, securing Scotland's independence after years of conflict. In his later years, Robert the Bruce suffered from illness but remained determined that his struggle for Scotland would continue even after his death. According to tradition, he asked that his heart be removed after his death and carried into battle by his loyal knight Sir James Douglas during a crusade. After Bruce died in 1329, Douglas carried the king's heart sealed in a small container as he traveled to fight in Spain. During battle, Douglas reportedly threw the container forward and charged after it, shouting that the king should lead the way even in death. Though Douglas was killed during the battle, the story became one of the most legendary symbols of loyalty and courage in Scottish history. History also records the powerful final moments of Sun Tzu's legendary descendant, Sun Jian, a warlord during the chaotic Three Kingdoms period of China. Sun Jian was known for his bravery and fierce leadership on the battlefield. During one campaign, he pursued enemy forces aggressively, pushing forward even when the terrain became dangerous. While leading the attack, he was struck by arrows and killed during the fighting. Though his death was sudden, his family would later continue his legacy. His son Sun Quan eventually founded the state of Eastern Wu, one of the major kingdoms of the Three Kingdoms era. Across cultures and centuries, these epic deaths reveal something deeply human about history. Some figures accepted death to remain loyal to their beliefs. Others chose death rather than surrender to enemies. Some died in battle while leading their people, refusing to step away from danger even when survival was possible. These final moments often turned historical figures into legends, because their endings reflected the same courage, determination, or conviction that defined their lives. And as we continue deeper into the final chapters of history's greatest lives, the stories become even more astonishing. Emperors who faced death with calm dignity, warriors who refused to retreat even when surrounded, and leaders whose final decisions changed the course of entire civilizations. History also remembers final moments that unfolded during the collapse of entire empires, when rulers faced the end of their power and chose how they would be remembered. One of the most dramatic examples is the death of Emperor Nero, the controversial Roman ruler whose reign ended in chaos during the year 68 CE. Nero had once ruled one of the most powerful empires in the world, but his leadership gradually lost support among Roman senators, military commanders, and even the population of Rome itself. Rebellions began to break out across the empire, and eventually the Roman Senate declared Nero a public enemy of the state. As his enemies closed in, Nero fled the imperial palace and took refuge in a villa outside Rome. Historical accounts describe the final hours of the emperor as a mixture of fear and desperation. When it became clear that soldiers were coming to arrest him, Nero reportedly prepared to take his own life rather than face execution in public. According to ancient historians, as he died, he uttered the famous words, "What an artist dies in me," reflecting his deep interest in music, theater, and performance. Nero's death marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the first imperial family that ruled Rome after Augustus. Another unforgettable historical ending belongs to samurai commander Minamoto, No Yoshitsune, one of the most legendary warriors in Japanese history. Yoshitsune lived during the late 12th century and played a crucial role in helping his brother Minamoto, no Yoritomo, defeat rival clans during the Genpei War. Yoshitsune became famous for his brilliant military tactics and daring battlefield strategies that brought victory to the Minamoto clan. However, political tension later developed between Yoshitsune and his brother, who had become the most powerful leader in Japan. Yoshitsune eventually found himself hunted by forces loyal to Yoritomo. In 1189, he took refuge in a northern fortress with a small group of loyal followers. When enemy troops surrounded the stronghold, Yoshitsune understood that escape was impossible. Following the samurai code of honor, he chose to end his life rather than be captured. His loyal companion Benkei reportedly stood at the bridge defending the entrance to the fortress, fighting off enemies alone, until he died standing upright from his wounds. The dramatic final stand of Yoshitsune and Benkei became one of the most famous heroic legends in Japanese history. History also records the astonishing death of King Louis XVI of France, whose execution symbolized the dramatic transformation of France during the French Revolution. Louis XVI had ruled France as an absolute monarch, but growing economic problems and political unrest led to revolutionary movements that challenged royal authority. As the revolution intensified, the monarchy was abolished, and Louis was put on trial for treason against the nation. In 1793, Louis XVI was sentenced to death by the revolutionary government. On the day of his execution, he was brought to the guillotine in Paris before a large crowd. Witnesses described how the former king attempted to speak to the people just before the execution, but the sound of drums ordered by revolutionary authorities drowned out his final words. With the fall of the blade, the monarchy that had ruled France for centuries effectively came to an end. The execution shocked Europe and marked one of the most powerful political turning points in modern history. Another extraordinary ending belongs to Tamerlane, also known as Timur, the powerful conqueror who built a vast empire across Central Asia during the 14th century. Timur was a brilliant military strategist whose campaigns stretched from Persia to parts of India and the Middle East. His armies were known for their discipline and devastating effectiveness, allowing him to control enormous territories. Even in his 70s, Timur continued preparing for new campaigns. In 1405, he began organizing an enormous invasion of China, planning to challenge the Ming dynasty. Despite his age, he insisted on leading the expedition personally. However, during the long winter journey across Central Asia, Timur fell seriously ill. He died during the campaign before reaching China, leaving behind a powerful empire that would soon fragment among rival successors. His death demonstrated how even the most ambitious conquerors could not escape the limits of time. Another legendary death in history belongs to Sir Francis Drake, the famous English sea captain and explorer. Drake became one of the most celebrated naval figures of the 16th century, known for circumnavigating the globe and playing a major role in England's victory over the Spanish Armada in 1588. In his later years, Drake continued leading naval expeditions in the Caribbean against Spanish forces. During an expedition in 1596, Drake became ill with dysentery while sailing near the coast of Panama. As his condition worsened, the great sea captain died aboard his ship far from his homeland. According to tradition, he was buried at sea in full armor, Placed inside a lead coffin and lowered into the ocean waters he had spent his life navigating. His burial at sea symbolized the life of a man whose greatest achievements were tied to exploration and naval warfare. Across centuries, these epic endings reveal how the final moments of powerful individuals often mirrored the lives they lived. Emperors died while their empires collapsed around them. Warriors chose honor rather than surrender. Kings faced the consequences of revolution. Explorers died in the distant lands they spent their lives seeking. Each story reminds us that history is not only shaped by victories and achievements, but also by the powerful final chapters that bring great lives to their close. History also records final moments where death arrived in the middle of incredible courage, determination, and the collapse of powerful worlds. One of the most legendary endings belongs to Emperor Constantine V Palaiologos, the final ruler of the Byzantine Empire. For more than 1,000 years, the Byzantine Empire had stood as the continuation of the Roman world in the East. Its capital, Constantinople, was one of the most powerful and fortified cities ever built. But by the year 1453, the empire had shrunk dramatically, and the rising Ottoman Empire under Sultan Mehmed II prepared for a final assault. Constantine XIII knew the situation was desperate. Ottoman armies surrounded the city with enormous forces and massive cannons capable of damaging the ancient walls that had protected Constantinople for centuries. Despite the overwhelming odds, Constantine refused to abandon the city. When Ottoman troops finally broke through the defenses after weeks of siege, the emperor removed his imperial symbols and joined the soldiers fighting in the streets. Historical accounts describe how he charged directly into the battle alongside his men. Constantine the Venal died during the chaos of the final defense, and his body was never definitively identified afterward. His death marked the end of the Byzantine Empire, an empire that had survived for more than a millennium. Another unforgettable death belongs to Stonewall Jackson, one of the most famous generals of the American Civil War. Jackson earned his nickname during the First Battle of Bull Run because of the way he stood firm like a stone wall against enemy attacks. He became one of the most respected commanders of the Confederate Army and worked closely with General Robert E. Lee during several important campaigns. In 1863, during the Battle of Chancellorsville, Jackson led a daring surprise attack that shattered Union forces. However, as darkness fell after the battle, Jackson was accidentally shot by his own soldiers, who mistook him for enemy cavalry while he was scouting ahead of his lines. The wounds forced doctors to amputate one of his arms, and although the surgery initially appeared successful, Jackson later developed pneumonia and died days later. His death was a major loss for the Confederate Army, and even his enemies respected his remarkable military skill. Another astonishing historical ending belongs to Hua Tuo, the legendary physician from ancient China during the late Han Dynasty. Hua Tuo became famous for his advanced medical knowledge and surgical techniques. Historical texts credit him with using herbal anesthesia, allowing patients to undergo surgeries centuries before similar methods became common elsewhere. However, Hua Tuo's life ended tragically due to political suspicion. The powerful warlord Cao Cao, who ruled much of northern China, suffered from severe headaches and asked Hua Tuo for treatment. According to historical records, Hua Tuo suggested a surgical operation to cure the condition. Cao Cao feared that the surgery might actually be an assassination attempt. Suspicious of the physician's intentions, Cao Cao ordered Hua Tuo imprisoned and eventually executed. Ironically, after Hua Tuo's death, Cao Cao's illness continued and eventually led to his own death years later. Many later historians saw this event as a tragic loss of medical knowledge that might have benefited generations. Another powerful ending belongs to Captain Lawrence Oates, a member of the British Antarctic expedition led by Robert Falcon Scott in 1912. The expedition had reached the South Pole, but faced extreme conditions during the return journey across the frozen continent. The team struggled with exhaustion, freezing temperatures, and limited supplies. Captain Oates suffered severe frostbite that slowed the group and threatened their survival. Realizing that his condition might endanger the entire expedition, Oates made a decision that became one of the most famous acts of sacrifice in exploration history. During a blizzard, he quietly stepped outside the tent into the freezing Antarctic night, reportedly saying, "I am just going outside and maybe some time." He never returned, though the rest of the expedition ultimately did not survive either. Oates's act of self-sacrifice became a powerful symbol of courage and loyalty. History also remembers the dramatic death of King Richard III of England, whose life ended during the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. Richard III faced the forces of Henry Tudor in a battle that would determine control of the English throne. As the battle turned against him, Richard made a desperate attempt to reach Henry Tudor directly, hoping to end the conflict with a single strike. Charging into the enemy lines with his knights, Richard fought fiercely until he was surrounded and killed. His defeat ended the long conflict known as the Wars of the Roses, and allowed Henry Tudor to become King Henry VII, beginning the Tudor dynasty that would later produce rulers such as Henry VIII and Elizabeth II. Across centuries, these extraordinary endings remind us that the final moments of history's most powerful figures often carry enormous significance. Empires ended with the fall of their last rulers. Battles shifted the future of nations, and individuals sometimes chose sacrifice rather than survival. And as we continue moving deeper into these unforgettable stories, even more astonishing deaths appear. Warriors who refused to retreat even when surrounded, leaders whose final actions inspired generations, and rulers whose deaths reshaped the political maps of entire continents. History's most unforgettable endings often arrive at moments when individuals stand face to face with fate, knowing that the final chapter of their story is about to be written. Sometimes these endings occur in the middle of battle, sometimes in quiet rooms far from the public eye, and sometimes in dramatic moments that change the direction of entire nations. One powerful example comes from the death of Che Guevara, the revolutionary figure whose life became a symbol of rebellion across the 20th century. Che Guevara had helped Fidel Castro overthrow the Cuban government in 1959, but after the revolution, he left Cuba to support other revolutionary movements across the world. In 1966, he traveled secretly to Bolivia, hoping to inspire a guerrilla uprising against the government. However, the campaign quickly encountered serious difficulties. The local population did not fully support the rebellion, and Bolivian military forces, assisted by international intelligence, began closing in on Guevara's small group of fighters. In October 1967, Guevara was captured after a firefight in the Bolivian mountains. He was held in a small village schoolhouse while soldiers awaited instructions. The next day, he was executed by Bolivian forces. Witnesses later described how Guevara reportedly faced the soldiers calmly, refusing to beg for his life. His death transformed him into one of the most recognizable revolutionary symbols in modern history, with his image becoming known around the world. Another powerful and unforgettable ending belongs to Salvador Allende, the president of Chile during the early 1970s. Allende was the first Marxist leader elected through democratic elections in Latin America. His presidency introduced major social and economic reforms, but it also created deep political divisions within the country. In 1973, Chile's military launched a coup against his government. As military forces surrounded the presidential palace in Santiago, Allende refused offers to escape the country. Instead, he remained inside the building while delivering a final radio speech to the people of Chile. In that speech, he expressed confidence that history would eventually judge the events of the day. Soon afterward, the palace was attacked by the military. Allende died inside the building during the final moments of the coup. His final stand inside the palace became one of the most powerful political moments in modern Latin American history. History also remembers the legendary final moments of General Antonio López de Santa Anna, the Mexican leader who dominated the politics of Mexico during much of the 19th century. Santa Anna was involved in many major conflicts, including the famous Battle of the Alamo during the Texas Revolution. His political career lasted decades, with periods where he ruled Mexico as president multiple times. Though Santa Anna survived wars, revolutions, and political exile, his final years were spent quietly after losing power. He died in 1876, after a long life filled with military campaigns and political struggles that shaped the early history of Mexico. His death marked the end of one of the most controversial and influential political careers in Mexican history. Another remarkable story comes from General George S. Patton, one of the most famous American commanders of World War II. Patton was known for his aggressive tactics and bold leadership during the Allied campaigns across Europe. His armies played a crucial role in pushing back German forces after the Normandy invasion and during the Battle of the Bulge. Yet despite surviving some of the largest battles of the 20th century, Patton's life ended in a completely unexpected way. In December 1945, months after the war had already ended, Patton was injured in a car accident while traveling through Germany. Though the crash was relatively small compared to the battles he had survived, it left him paralyzed. Several days later, he died from complications related to the injury. The fact that such a famous battlefield commander died not in combat, but in a quiet accident shocked many people at the time. These epic endings scattered across centuries reveal something powerful about the human story. Kings, generals, explorers, philosophers, and revolutionaries all faced their final moments in different ways. Some died fighting for the causes they believed in. Others accepted their fate with calm dignity. Some deaths marked the fall of entire empires, while others became symbols that inspired generations long after the individuals themselves were gone. What makes these stories unforgettable is that they remind us how unpredictable history can be. The most powerful rulers sometimes fall suddenly. The greatest warriors sometimes meet quiet endings far from the battlefield. And sometimes the final moments of a life become the moment when a legend is truly born. If you enjoy these deep, slow explorations of history's most fascinating stories, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps keep these long, calm journeys into the past alive for everyone who enjoys learning while relaxing. And if there is another strange or fascinating moment from history you would like to explore next, let us know in the comments. Until the next story, rest well and let history continue whispering through time.